The horse came like a rumor. First its breath steamed a line in the gray morning, then the knock of hooves in a tired, uneven cadence. A travois followed, wood groaning where too much weight dragged slow over frozen ruts. Wrapped in canvas and old leather, something vast and broken rode the frame, a man whose size had been both rumor and reputation for as long as anyone in town could remember. He was legend compressed into a single wheezing body, hair matted with ice, one hand folded over a chest that rose and fell like a tired bellows. They called him names before they saw his face. The mayor's wife drew curtains, children shrank behind skirts. Men who made a living with iron and rope spat into frozen earth and told stories to shore up courage. Old wives crossed themselves with the habitual motions of isolation. Everyone had a memory of a story. Silas Thorne as a wolf, Silas as a thief of livestock, Silas as the one who'd once bent a fence post with bare hands. And that memory made their mouths small and their doors smaller. No one would take him in. That was the sentence that rolled through the town like a winter wind. Doc Patterson bent over the travois for a lone, perfunctory look and shook his head as if the cold had nicked his resolve. "Too far gone for what I can do here," he said, and he meant the limits of his medicine and the limits of their willingness. Mayor Pritchard, who preferred law to risk, folded his hands and said the town could not be expected to shelter trouble. Mrs. Hendricks told the minister privately that Providence had its ways, which in that moment meant keeping other people's misfortune at a distance. Martha Jorger heard none of that from the street. She heard the horse's breath and the slap of leather on wood and something like a child's thud of fear that kept her hands from stilling at the hearth. She was a woman whose life had been largely lived with her hands in things that burned or broke, boiling syrups, clamped feathers, poultices that stained her nails black. Her house smelled of bayberry and pine, of iron vinegar and the soft green tang of crushed comfrey. She had a small room lined with jars whose chalked names were written in a hand as steady as a plowline: plantain, yarrow, elderflower. The town knew her by shorthand, the big woman, Georger, with a curl of condescension, as if a body could supply all there was to know. At the stove, she unhooked a pot by habit, not by thought, letting the spoon grind a rhythm on the lip as the town's refusals bled through the thin clapboard. She had a flesh that kept her warm in deep and honest ways. She had hands that could strip a hide and stitch a cheek of ham and press a poultice to a fevered throat. The way she moved was practical, unromantic, a loading of tallow, a smoothing of linen, the arranging of a quilt so the seams met in neat, stubborn rows. Her bones had angles you could follow like landmarks beneath the generous slopes of her body. Those slopes, she knew, made people uneasy. They thought size meant leisure, that someone who took so much space must take less care. They did not see that her size had been earned, the way a well-built hearth earns its mantle, by weathering seasons and carrying heat. She stepped out into the street with a folded blanket over her arm and the smell of sage in her pocket. There was a small breath of a question in the crowd as she passed. The mayor tipped his chin as if she were a draft. Doc Patterson looked at her with the clinical pity reserved for an oddity. Samuel the blacksmith, whose hands were almost as broad as hers, saw only a woman doing what needed doing and said nothing. Martha did not ask. She did what she could. She had done it in other crises, in colics and bleeds and late-night births, where the town's moral hand forgot itself, but their bodies remembered that when someone could make heat, that someone should. She did not argue. She put Silas's travois on her sled with a pair of horses Samuel lent her, and wrapped him with quilts seamed from many hands and many winters. The town watched the slow parade toward her cabin like a jury waiting for a verdict they already intended. "She'll do it wrong," Thomas Fletcher snorted from the doorway of the tavern, his grin a patch of rotten teeth. Words like soot fell into the air. Martha heard them without turning. People could be cruel in the exactness of their cruelty, as if picking the most hurtful phrase were a duty. But she knew her work. Her method had always been thrift and warmth. Keep the blood moving, quiet the shivering, clean the wound. For the first time in years, she felt other people's eyes trace the shape of her back and count the space she took, as if that were the thing that mattered. She let them count, and she turned a key that fit no measure of their smallness. She opened a door. Inside, the cabin was a map of usefulness. A shelf held kettles blackened at the bottom, a jam jar contained pins of different heads, a nail board hung with dried herbs braided into scented ropes. Cloths were folded into squares that could be used as rolls or bandages. The stove chimney smoked steady and trustingly. Light from the window pitched across a table with 2 chairs, and on the table was a mug for water and a loaf wrapped in cloth. Her bed took up half the room and was, by habit, always ready for another body's weight. A quilt she'd sewn from mismatched squares of husband day and sashwork lay at the edge where she often warmed her feet. They laid Silas on the bed, larger than the mattress in truth, limbs spilling like major tributaries, and Martha began with a quiet competence, the kind that never sought applause. She pulled back the canvas and found a wound under his shoulder where dark notches of dried blood met a rawness that smelled of iron and frost. It was not, she decided quickly, a wound that needed fancy. It needed clean water, a poultice to draw out what it could not digest, and a warmth that encouraged tissue to close rather than contract like something that had given up. Her hands worked like a clock's inside, precise and without sentiment. She warmed water in a small pan, crushed comfrey between her palms until it made a paste like moss, added ground marshmallow root and a touch of ash to make a soft draw. The paste smelled of the earth and old things. She bathed him with cloths that smelled like lavender and hearth smoke, and the man under the blankets made a sound like a bell that had found a crack. When she wrapped the poultice and tied it with a cord, she did not look at his face. Looking, she had learned, could be dangerous. He burned through the next day. Fever took him like a tide. Heat, then low, then heat again with a trembling that started in his fingers and traveled to the teeth. His skin, beneath the thick hair and the grime of the road, had a sheen like a pond in thunder, glassy, then suddenly sharp. He would wake and then slide back into a place where speech left him. His breaths were thin, as if each were a ration. At one point, he clutched at the quilt, and the hand that emerged had knuckles like old posts, scarred and set. Martha sat and held water to his lips, her fingers firm at the jaw. She brought him broth, scraps of meat simmered until they had the scent of nourishment, and never once hesitated in the measurement of kindness. That in itself was radical where she came from. The town had a ledger of what it would offer, and kindness did not often score. As the fever pitched and reared, something else emerged, the small animal of fear inside the man. In the middle of the night, he sat up like someone who had been suddenly woken from a dream in which he had been hunted. His eyes were flecked, in that way fever eyes are when they are a map of other things, peril, memory, guilt, and he gripped Martha's hand like an anchor. Heat first, she told him, in a voice that was an instrument of habit, a rule kept in the marrow of anyone who has watched fever take steam from a living thing. Warmth holds the edges together. Heat, then everything else. He let her lie down beside him on the narrow bed. It was not an act of romance in the town's terms, it was a practical improvisation. Her body was a large, even heat source. Her ribs rose and fell in a pattern steady as a stove. She stripped off the blanket from one side and lay pressed against him, her weight arranged so it did not crush but supported. Her breasts, her thighs, the broad cord of her belly, everything settled into a making of shelter. His body, which had been called beast and otherness, flexed against her warmth and found relief. The fever leaned into the steady rise and fall and slowed like a beast soothed by a human cadence. There were sounds in that dark. The pop of freezing sap, the old wood settling, the low throb of a man's near-silent breathing. Outside, the town slept with all the small comforts of people who have made fences around their pity. In the cabin, two bodies who had lived hard and alone found that the smallest truce, heat, could be decisive. It was not miraculous as a blaze of angels. It was the undramatic, miraculous thing a warm body can do for another cold one. In the morning, the fever had faded from his face enough that the eyes that blinked open were human in their surprise. When Silas came back from the place the fever had taken him, he saw Martha sitting by the window, hands wrapped around a mug that steamed quietly. Light carved her in amber, broad shoulders softened by shadow, hair pulled back from a face that had been made by the weather. He looked at the mansion of her arms and the map of her palms with a kind of bewildered reverence, the same way one might look at a safe harbor after a shipwreck. For the first time, the name Martha Jogger did not lift with the weight of gossip in his head. Instead, it landed as a fact. "You kept me," he said, his voice like gravel that was being raked smooth. "I kept you," she said, and the simplicity of the answer was its own truth. Recognition came not with a grand pronouncement, but in small adjustments. He watched how she moved the kettle closer and the way she fished a clean shirt from the chest and frowned at the stiffness of his fingers and chose a different bandage knot. She watched how his hands trembled when he tried to hold the spoon and the way his jaw tightened when someone called his name and meant it as an accusation. They grew private languages out of these things, a look that said, "Food first," a brush of calloused fingers that meant, "It will not stay like this." In the quiet, they traded scars and brief histories, curt fragments of the mountain, the loneliness, the things that had turned them into what they were. But they traded more than words. They traded a rhythm. She fed, he packed. She mended, he hauled. The living, in their hands, began to resemble the living again. Word drifted back to town like smoke. The mayor tutted and told people not to be stupid with their sympathies. Mrs. Hendricks clicked her tongue and prayed that the minister take a stand. Rumor decided that Martha had gone soft or foolish, or worse, that she had been making herself foolish for the attention of a man who had long been a story. Thomas Fletcher, who made cruelty a sport between drink and sleep, spat once more, claiming it as victory that he had been right about everyone's soft spots. "You'll see," he snickered in the market, elbows resting on a barrel. "You'll see him take the town. He'll be the brush at the back of the door, and you'll be the hook he hangs on." Silas, who for so long had been the margin of town conversation, became the subject of small, spiteful hypotheticals, talk that coiled around Martha like a rope. Men who were decent in ordinary ways found it easier to be small, and in that smallness they found a kind of joy. Samuel the blacksmith, who had lent her horses without comment, brought small repairs and a cautious nod now and then. Doc Patterson came with a hoof full of pragmatics, a stitch done here, a poultice renewed there. He told Martha in a tone that had the careful quality of a man who could not afford mistakes that he doubted Silas was safe to remain in town because people did not forgive easily. "Let him be," he said, "but take care. Town anger is a thing that can spread." Martha listened and returned his concern with the quiet she always afforded public anxieties. She had been scorned. She knew the town's measures and the cruelty that was its default mode, but she also knew what heat did, and that knowledge outweighed the ledger of social approval. In the evenings, she began to hum a soft tune as she sewed, a tune that had no words but fit the beat of a hand working and the slow return of the breath of a man who had once been thought of as no more than a storm. The mutuality of their dependence rewired them both in ways the town's gossip could not measure. Silas learned to ask for water by naming the nearest object rather than roaring his need. He folded his large frame into corners with a new patience. Martha learned the precise angle to rest a fractured arm to ease the night sweat, and the right moment to speak so the fever did not climb back. They measured days by the small successes: a good night's rest, a day without delirium, a laugh that sounded like anything other than a release of fear. One afternoon, the town's cruelty took the form of a testing, and testing is most often cowardice in firmer clothes. Fletcher stumbled into the square with drink and a swelling grievance and found Silas standing by the smithy, hands on the anvil, eyes molten with a reserve that was not used to being observed. "Been keeping the beast warm, have you?" Fletcher jeered, loud enough for men to look up from their work. Silas did not answer at once. He let the insult hover like a fly above a wound, and then his jaw closed like a trap. There was an old muscle that worked across his face when he measured a danger. He had learned to hold his hands because hands were sometimes the only things to do a job, and he had learned that adult life required weighing a blow and choosing the one that saved the rest. He stepped forward a pace, not threatening, but certainly not yielding. Martha, who had come into the square with a bundle of freshly mending, set the bundle down and stood between them like a small, immovable hill. "Leave him alone, Thomas," she said, in a tone that was not loud but had the definite ring of a bell. "He's done no wrong."
Fletcher smirked and shoved the heel of his hand into his mouth like a man tasting his own courage. "He'll take more than what's given," he sneered. "Mark my words, men like him don't come to town to take soup." Silas's response was a low sound in his chest, a warning that rolled like ice on water. It wasn't violence yet, but the room of the town held its breath at the possibility that it might be. In the crowd, someone who had been watching with eager malice shifted and left as a supplicant for their own safety. "You keep your mouth," Silas said finally. He did not touch Fletcher. The threat in his voice was not the promise of a fight, it was a map of consequence, a showing of what would be done if the words behind him grew claws. The drunk retreated a step and then another, dragging his pride like a tattered coat. That night, people clustered in corners and told more imaginative stories. Fear loves a stage, and the town loved to rehearse endings where they were unassailable. Fletcher's nibbling complaint rose in the ears of trappers who had their own grudges. Men with names like Pike and Jameson, who spent their seasons taking what they needed from the fringes, listened in tavern talk and found in the story of a man sheltered by a big woman a foolishness they could exploit. They met across the river in a low-lit tavern that smelled of boiled stew and wet leather. Their plans were not heroic. They were not principled. They were small and mean and offered the rush of the hunt. "We take him out, scare the lot of 'em," Jameson suggested, his eyes hungry for the shape of the thing to come. "He scares the town, keeps stock off the hills. We'll take him for 2 reasons, profit and the proving of a point." Pike nodded as if the plan already sat on him like a warm jacket. "And she'll run with him," he said, thinking himself clever. "She'll follow, and then we'll have both." They did not realize that the town's cruelty was not a construction powerful enough to endure the gravity of what Martha and Silas were building: warmth and duty and a kind of slow tenderness.
Nor did they understand that the mountain made certain kinds of men who, when pushed, became a terrible solidity. Martha heard the talk only as a small brush of air. She had more immediate concerns most days. The aching stiffness of Silas's fingers as they tried to knit, the supply of staples, the way winter approached like a wall. She patched shirts, traded a jar of balm for a sack of flour, and kept the wood stove black with embers. She watched Silas sleep with attention that had nothing to do with the town's eyes. She watched because he was a man who had been returned to living by the work she had done with her hands. She felt, sometimes, the weight of being a spectacle resting on her shoulders, and it made her walk smaller through crowds. But inside the cabin, she moved in a different grammar. Her size was a resource, a store of heat in a world where winter was a calculating enemy. Silas, when he could stand long enough, went to the mountain's edge and walked with his hands in the pockets of old coats. He had been raised to live by his arms and his silence, to set traps and to haul meat from cliffs. He was learning to carry forgiveness like a tool, not a luxury. In the hours when their tasks were done, he would sit across from Martha at the table and attend to a conversation like a man who had learned to listen for the last few years as his preferred talent. He would tell her small things about the mountain, where the fir trees bent to the snowfall, which creeks were hollowed by water, the way wind could find one's bones and settle in if you were not careful. She told him about her mother, who had taught her to stitch in straight lines no matter who watched, about a brother who'd left and never returned, about the first bitter wine she had brewed and the first bed she had made that did not sag. Slowly, a different kind of reputation began to accrue, not the town's version, but the islanded truth. A man tended by a woman who used her bulk as a tool rather than a problem. People could not transform overnight, even when evidence contradicted them. The chorus in the market continued to hum old stories. But a few old men who had seen storms and sins longer than any gossip sat longer at the tavern's edge and watched the quiet work of life being put back together. One evening, as the world reduced itself to the color of twilight and the smoke in the stove pitched more generously, there was knocking at Martha's door. It was not the cautious knock of a neighbor. It was a deliberate rap, like someone testing for a response. She opened the door to find a woman with ice in her lashes, the minister's wife perhaps, or another woman who measured the town's moral with a particular sternness. "You should know," she said, words clipped and trembling as if sending them was a duty. "There are men in the tavern saying they'll make a point. Thomas Fletcher's not always alone in his mischief." Martha's fingers closed around the door jamb like a vice. She was not a woman who asked for protection. She provided it. But the thought of people thinking a house where she and Silas sat could be turned into a way of gaining a cheap reputation by others, that thought made her weight shift in a different way. "They'll be let to talk," she said. "Men like that need words. They think words are sharp, when really they're only hungry." The woman lingered, perhaps for a response that would make them both safer. Martha said nothing more than another set of practical instructions about how to batten doors and where to keep the shelved knives. The churchwoman left with a cluck and a hush that sounded like gossip wrapped in piety. That night, Silas sat by the hearth and watched the way she folded cloth. She moved with a quiet that made the room feel like a spring swept of leaves. He touched the edge of a stitch and then withdrew his hand as if the gesture had been too intimate. "They'll come," he said finally, not as a threat, but as a fact of seasons and men. "If they plan to make a point, they'll do it when it's darkest." "We've weathered worse," Martha replied, and the phrase was not bravado so much as a statement of resource. They had heat, they had hands, and they had the ability to bend a situation into something survivable. But beneath the steady pragmatism, there was a strain, like a violin's string pulled too tight. Martha had a map of humiliations in her mind that she had rarely shared. Silas had a ledger of wrongs that his muscular ways had been used to settle. Their futures were not a smooth river. They were a collection of eddies and hard-turned currents. Across the river, three men laughed softly in the dim of a tavern and plotted. Their laughter had a quality of children trying on cruelty to see how it fit. They would go into the night with lanterns that made ghosts of them and ropes that were more about theater than necessity. They did not know what it meant to be held in the steadiness of someone else's warmth. They did not know that Martha's body was not a place for mockery, but a hearth hardened by years of tending. They did not know that Silas, who had once been a story at the edge of town, had hands that remembered how to protect. The next morning, a note fluttered like a dead leaf on Martha's porch, folded into a neat packet like a calling card. It contained no immediate threat, but the words were a tidal push, small, cruel, precise. "Let him go," it read in a cramped hand, "or else." Martha picked the paper up with mittened fingers and held it until it softened from the heat of her hand. She put it in her pocket like another object to be catalogued. She did not show it to Silas straight away. There are measures of dignity she had learned to preserve. Silence was one, planning was another. He woke in the middle of the afternoon and found her at the window, eyes tracking the distance where a line of smoke might mean men passing or only someone burning fallen brush. "They plan," he said, sensing rather than needing the objects of her attention. "They amuse themselves. Let them amuse. We feed the birds." There was a crack in the sentence. It was the kind of thing people said when they did not want to show the size of their worry. They began to decide, more slowly than fear would have advised. To move was an act that would concede town defeat. To stand and fight would be to invite a round that might break the few things they'd built back together. In the calculus of survival, they weighed the things they owned: a cabin, a small field, a box of stitched linens, a stool that had been ruled by two hands. They weighed other things as well: the way their days had come to fit in one another's margins, and the way the mountain breathed in a place farther up where Silas's cabins, or what counted as cabins, sheltered men who had chosen isolation. That evening, as the light folded and the stove threw out its last generous heat, Silas stood at Martha's door and looked at the road that led up. Snow in deepening places clung like white wool. The air smelled of iron and leaf. He turned and saw her watching him, and for the first time it was not pity or utility on his face. It was a question. "Come with me?" he asked, and what it lacked in fancy, it made up in the carefulness of an offer. It was as if he were handing her a gloved hand instead of the sword of his intent. He was not taking. He was asking her to join him on the mountain, which was a statement of equality in a language neither of them used often. Martha leaned against the doorjamb and let the words settle between them like snow settling on a field. To go would mean giving up the shallow claim of family she'd always half expected from the town, and instead choosing the possibility of belonging in a place with different measures. To stay would mean staying under the gaze of people who had already marked her as an oddity. Her chest tightened in a way that felt like a ledger settling. "I don't leave things half finished, Silas," she said, "but I don't stay to be the thing they make of me either." He nodded once, as if that were the only necessary answer. He did not promise that the mountain would be easier. He did not claim it as heaven. He said only what he could keep. "Up there, you make the rules. Down here, they'll write them for you." They began then the small unwinding of arrangements. They patched the doors and put aside supplies as one might ready for a journey where nothing would be assured. Martha measured coats and mended seams with a new kind of attention. Silas fixed harnesses and bound up the place where his shoulder had been nicked, fingers working quickly as if familiarity with danger made him more precise than any bedside vow. There was a tenderness in the motions that was not yet spoken as love, but that tasted like the same thing, the habit of being wanted and wanting. As they moved through those days, there were small escapes from the town's narrative. Samuel gave them a bag of salted beef and 2 horses. Doc Patterson handed over a small jar of antiseptic with the sort of glance that meant, in his own way, that he approved of taking life by the hands. Even men who had been quiet observers found ways to ease the hardship of leaving. It was only the most vocal who scolded. On the last night before any planned leaving, Martha sat with a quilt thrown over her lap and listened to Silas packing. He wrapped his tools in a cloth and hummed a mountain tune they had not known the name of. His hands, in silhouette against the lamp, looked like the shape of work itself. She thought of the first night she had pressed heat against him, and of how the world had leaned toward that simple, unvarnished kindness. The town's hubbub receded as if an ordinary end had been arranged, but in the uneasy peace, there is always the feeling of a heartbeat offset, something not yet decided. When the 3 men set out from the tavern in the late hours, it was with lanterns and a swagger that had been fueled by drink and a desire to make themselves larger in a world that made them small. They threaded paths with the certainty of men who had never had to count on others to keep warm. They did not know the North's way of teaching humility. Martha slept that night the way people do when their minds are full, but their limbs have agreed on rest. In the dark, she felt Silas's arm brush her waist and did not wake at the touch because the touch was itself a comfort now. In the hush, she thought of the mountains outlined like a thumbprint on the back of the sky, and of the way a promise can be small and mighty at once. Outside, the town settled into its own cycles, unsatisfied, yet content that they would not have to face whatever happened if it were to happen. And somewhere on the ridge, lantern light moved slow as a thought. It made a washed seam against the horizon, an idea of figures rather than human shapes. The night was cold enough to harden breath into small imps of steam that the wind stole. The 3 men picked their way across open land with the false confidence of those who measure courage by the violence of their actions rather than the labor of keeping another alive. Martha woke before dawn with a feeling like someone had called her name in a dream. The house was a small chamber of soft sounds, the ticking of a distant clock, the mouse of wind under the eaves, the stifled breathing of a man who had been given back from a fever. She rose and moved to the window, peering into a world that was always slightly different in the early hours, softer edges, more honest colors. On the horizon, a dark thing moved. For a moment, she thought it was a fox. Then the mind translated the shape into a decision, straight line of 3 figures with glints of metal catching the faint dawn. Her hands, accustomed to the busy work of saving and mending, tightened into the habitual preparedness of a woman who has always had to make do. There was no panic in the way she folded the quilt. There was an economy of motion and a long, steadying breath. Silas, who had been awake long enough to feel the cold come in at the corners of the hearth, came to the window beside her. He looked out, and his face changed in a way she recognized not as fear, but as calculation. "They came down," he said. 3 syllables like a bell swung slowly. Martha reached for the lanterns and the knives she favored for garden work, not for their violence, but for their usefulness. She thought, briefly, and not without humor, that the town had made them fools by its own refusal to see the work they were doing as heroic. But this was not a moment for bitterness. It was a moment that required all the quiet, stubborn skill they had cultivated together. They moved in the practiced hush of those who had been preparing for something without naming it. Chairs were pushed under tables, blankets folded with quick hands into packs. The house that had offered warmth and recovery to a man who had been their enemy, or their myth, became in a few minutes a staging ground for a decision that would remove them from safety rather than surrender it. Silas strapped on a belt he had not worn in weeks. Martha swung a small sack of herbs over her arm, the weight of years of tending as substantial as any pack. They paused at the threshold for the briefest of moments, two bodies pressed against the frame of the door that had kept them both safe in different ways. Silas looked down at her with a softness that had no need for words. "When we go," he murmured, "we keep the road in front of us." Martha nodded. "We go like we mean to stay somewhere else," she said. They stepped out into the cold together. The tracks in the snow were fresh and told a story that had already begun before them. The town slept on into a moral comfort that had not yet learned to reckon with the consequences of its cruelty. Above all, the mountain waited, not as sanctuary, not yet, but as a geography of choices that would ask them to use what they had been given in ways that would render them something more than rumor. Behind them, the three men moved like a shadow that had been given a shape and was now intent on filling it. They did not know what hearth they would meet, what hands would meet their lantern light. They only knew the pleasure of a plan hatched among drunks and cowards. Martha adjusted the quilt at her shoulder, feeling the weight of the world around them balance and then tip. She took Silas's hand in a way that was no longer tentative, but not yet possessive. The two hands, one broad and calloused, the other large and warm, fit together the way a winter fit hides a stone. Practical, honest, necessary. The first steps up the road were not dramatic. The air bit their cheeks. The two horses Samuel had lent them stamped and shook. The town, from its distance, held its opinions like a thick garment that could be shrugged. But as they walked, the town's voices grew smaller and the mountain scale receded into the truthful size of their own choices. They had not yet reached the place of refuge. They had not yet crossed the threshold into the mountain's governance. The things that would decide whether they were safe, skill, the rightness of their reasons, the cruelty of their hunters, had only just begun to assemble. There was wind in the hollows, and the echo of a plan cast from the tavern like a stone into a pond. The ring of the ripple had not yet reached its shore. Stay with them. See what it looks like when two people make warmth into a life and refuse to let a town's story decide what they are. They had not gone far when the lantern light that had seemed a timid procession at first began to grow teeth. The three men, warmed by drink and the thrill of cruelty, kept the road at their backs like a memory they intended to make real. Snow packed into the ruts and the horses' breaths hung in clouded scarves that the early sun would not loosen. For a while they walked in a careful silence, two bodies with packs, a man with more shadow than plan. It was a small march of people who believed a story could be finished by a night's violence. Martha knew the country by the way the wind nested in hollows. She watched the line of tree trunks and felt the crunch of snow underfoot as a language. Each footfall had a meaning: soft, hard, slipping, mend. She put a hand on the horse's flank and felt the animal's heat answer hers. Beside her, Silas moved with the economy of a man whose life had been a ledger of effort, hands quick to tie, quick to secure. His eyes flicked to tracks in the snow as if reading a page, and the way his jaw worked told her he was counting risks. They made camp beneath a stand of pines, a narrow shelter where the snow lay thinner and the wind had not yet taken to hollowing bones. Martha set a pot over a fire made from split twigs and old coal, hands efficient and sure. Silas put his back to a tree and leaned his head until his knotted forehead smoothed for a moment. The quiet was not peace so much as the fragile hold one takes against a void. The first lantern caught at the edge of the ridge as the three men came down in a line more like predators than townsfolk. They kept low, soft shoes pulling them forward on a path that skirted the pines. The plan had been simple: take by surprise, shame by spectacle, return with the story of terror to tell at the tavern and at home. They had not anticipated the way the forest insisted on being its own witness. Martha saw them because she had a way of seeing that belonged to people who had mended more than fabric. The reflection of a sudden, too bright lamp leapt across the snow, and she heard, before she understood the meaning, the rasp of a boot that was not a neighbor's. Silence tightened in the chest like a fist. She did what she had always done. She prepared the things the animals of life needed. She wrapped more blankets around the horses, passed a bundle to Silas, gripped a knife she used for splitting root. Calm was a practice as much as an action. They were upon them in a breath. Light flared like a bell, and men swore, an ugly sound in the trees. One lunged forward, arms reaching for the nearest warmth. The horse, a bundle, the two of them. Splinters and shouts answered.
Silas moved as if the training of many winters had been stored in the bones. Strong hands closed on collars, a body stepped forward like an anvil. His first move was to push, to place himself between the men and the small wooden blaze. It was not a show, it was defense. Martha, who had never been afraid to trade force for necessity when the living were at stake, vaulted the low fire pit not in a graceful arc, but with a gardener's power. One of the men reached for her like a boy teasing a thing smaller than him, expecting to find a plaything. He found instead a weight he had not tallied. Martha struck with the flat of her hand into a jaw the way one might slam a shut window against weather, decisive, without desire. The man staggered back, surprise cutting the air from his lungs. They fought with the blunt instruments of half-trained hands and recklessness. A lantern fell and bled light into a gutter of black. One of the trappers lunged for Silas, who caught him at the wrist and turned his weight so the attacker stumbled into the snow and did not rise. Another went for the horses, hands slick with intent. Silas met him with a bitter, efficient force, his elbow crushing into ribs enough to fold breath into a thin ribbon. Voices rose, ugly and astonished, when men who had thought themselves brave found breath failing and limbs not obeying. Martha's hands were everywhere where they needed to be. She jammed the butt of a shovel into the thigh of the man advancing on the pack. She took the length of a rope and wrapped it around a wrist and cinched. She moved like a woman who had learned to use her mass as problem-solving, not spectacle. There was no thrill in the fight for her, only the same anxious fidelity she brought to poultices and hot broth. She punched, shoved, tripped, and finally, when one of the men lunged at Silas with a knife stolen from a pocket, she hurled her whole weight forward in a roll that knocked him off balance. The blade missed what it meant to find. The intrigue of violence was replaced by the reality of pain. Silas's hands were no less savage when they were forced to be. He did not seek blood with a hunger. He drove an attacker back until it could not stand, then used the butt of a club to free his arm and to make sure that the man would not rise with the same intent. The swing of his tool folded the attacker's features into a look of defeat. In the end, there were 3 men on the snow, groaning and broken more by surprise than design. They had learned more than once that the mountain taught men to be tidy with harm. One lay with a broken wrist, another a deep welt on the shoulder. None rose quickly. When the fight stopped, the quiet that moved through the pines was different. It was the hush of people who had been given a gift they did not like. The knowledge that what they had intended for spectacle had been met by 2 people who were simply unwilling to be taken.
He taught her how to read the sky for wind in degrees she had not cared to calculate before. They hung furs with a sense for draft and for dignity, making beds that were nests of warmth and not merely places to lie down. There were practical tests of trust. Martha showed him where she kept the tins of lard and explained the way to render it down for seconds of poor weather. Silas demonstrated how to smoke meat without letting it go bitter. They made a covenant of small things, a place by the stove where each would sit when the meal was ready, an order to their tools that meant someone could be found in the dark. With time, their hands learned to find work in each other's motions. He nailed and she sewed. She salted fish and he stacked roofs. Each task was a sentence in a longer conversation where language was put to service, not style. When they could spare a moment for speech, it was not poetry but habit that tied them. They told small stories of what had been lost and what had been saved. Silas spoke of a brother who had followed a cliff into a winter with the sort of pragmatic sorrow that did not need consolation, only a place to be understood. Martha told of a mother who had taught her how to stitch a quilt so tight that wind could not find its teeth. In the exchange, they learned to be unafraid to reveal edges, badly scarred wrists, the empty places left by people who had gone. Romance for them was a thing of recurring gestures. It arrived in the smallness of a loaf cut and shared, in the way Silas would prop Martha's boots by the stove and rub them until they were dry and smelling like pine. It arrived when she braided his hair back from his forehead after a storm had left him bristled and indrawn, the hands of a woman who knew how to keep a man from freezing into the shape he had learned to hold. Nothing was loud. They were two people learning that being wanted was not humiliation and that caring could be fierce without being bright. Neighbors on the mountain were fewer and the rules different. A hunter's nod meant admiration, an offer of salt or sugar a great kindness. They traded meat and wood with those who had chosen solitude by choice rather than exile by town decree. Samuel's gift of salted beef had come in handy for months, stretched thin over days when snow made the valley like a lid. There were men who watched them in the distance, and then, grudgingly, stepped closer with trade and help. The mountain kept its own counsel and tended each other's wounds with old knowledge rather than gossip. Seasons turned the way seasons do, one by one, each with its particular sharpness. Spring thinned the snow and brought the first brittle green of plants that had known only cold. Summer was hands and sweat and a flavor of freedom. Autumn was the slow melancholy of stacked wood and measured stores. The hardest was the winter that came 3 seasons after they had arrived, the one that demanded a vow. That year, the storm came as if it were a thing that had been saving itself. It built in layers, wind first, then colder, then the kind of snow that walked slow and meant to stay. The woodpile became the center of the cabin's life, a clock of necessity. They checked the seals of the windows and wrapped the joints of the walls with oakum and rag. Evenings were long, and the light that remained was spare and golden. Conversation dwindled. People in such weather learned to speak with their mouths closed and hands open. One night, the storm knocked the rhythm of things into a dangerous silence. The wind found its way under eaves and argued with the stove. The temperature pressed like thumb on a wound. When the door banged against its latch like a dull heart, Silas got up with the reflex of someone who wakes to a storm in the way the body knows what to do. The wind buffeted accents from the snow like teeth at a rope. The stove, which had been a friend, began to lose its temper, less flame, more stubborn ember. They huddled, and the cold threaded bones with a patience that was cruel. Martha felt her feet go numb before the rest. Silas watched the color of her cheeks as if counting it into some ledger he could learn to read. Food became a thing measured in small spoons. Wood had to be managed with a conservative precision that was new to Martha, who had never been at the center of such scarcity. She saved the last of the dried apples for a night when hunger threatened to make their temper brittle. The mountain taught them the humility of not having more than they could use. When the gale ceased, it left the world a pale, patient thing. The snow lay like a cloth of forced silence. They measured their supplies and counted the small, necessary luxuries. In that testing, their bond tightened into something ritualized. At night, they pressed against each other under layered quilts, not because anyone demanded it, but because they had learned it to be a means of survival. Martha's body, wide and constant, was once again shelter in the literal sense. Her weight formed a calmed topography against which Silas could find warmth and the steadying of a breath. On one cold night, with the wind a dull chorus outside, Silas turned in the half-light and placed his hand upon her and said, simply, "Never stop." He did not ask her for anything beyond what they already were. It was a promise and a plan, a language of practical devotion. Martha answered with a grunt that was almost a laugh, and then with a hand that wrapped around his as their fingers found one another. "Never stop," she repeated, and the phrase became their prayer of practical things. Stoke the fire, mend the net, check the trap, come back from the hill. Word filtered back to the valley, as things will, in a stream that bypassed the gossip and went instead to the ledgered men who measured things by reliability. A letter arrived one autumn, carried on a man's back and smelling faintly of the town's tobacco. The signature was awkward but genuine. Mayor Pritchard's hand, complicated by the minister's endorsement and a ribbon of contrition. The page said what apologies sometimes do, that shame had passed like fall and that the town regretted how things had been handled. It offered invitations: come back, be seen properly, be part of the community in a way deemed respectable now that the rumor had cooled. They read the letter by the stove, the light catching the ink like an accusation. Martha sat at the table with the paper folded into small sections. Her hands, which had folded quilts and bandaged wounds, smoothed the paper as if it were cloth. Silas watched in the slowness of a man who had been given plenty of time to learn how to measure motives. They had been asked to come back into a town that had never truly watched them, only formed stories to entertain thought. "I won't let them decide the rhythm of my life again," Martha said, the sentence as factual as weather. She handed the letter back, not burning it, but not keeping it either. There was gratitude in the offer, perhaps, but gratitude tempered by the taste of blood still on their teeth from men who had come to steal them for sport. The letter smelled of the town's attempt at repair and of its inability to be better without cost. Silas folded his hands in his lap and looked down at the grain in the table. "We do this," he said, meaning the mountain and the stove and the nights that survived them, "because we chose it. Let them tend their conscience. It is a poor kind of return when it starts with apology and ends in needing us to fix them." They sent no reply of invitation. Instead, they wrote a brief note, not rude but firm. Thanks for the thought, but they had found something else, a real work that required two people. Martha sealed it in wax, the way old people made things permanent, and Samuel took it on his trip down in spring when his work took him toward town. Samuel delivered their refusal with the same economy that had made him a good neighbor. No lectures, only the news that the letter had been seen and accepted for what it was. At times, what they lived felt like ritual: stacking wood, mending coats, naming the birds that returned each spring. At times, it felt like the great small mercy of being allowed to be useful. Martha's body, which the town had once reduced to gossip, was taken by mountain neighbors as an asset. Heat in winter, strength in the lifting of heavy sacks, the surety of hands that could seam a kettle lid. Her size was a resource in the landscape, and in that new economy it was honored rather than sneered at. The word people used was not cruel, it was practical admiration. There were darker hours. Silas carried the burden of the night they had fought.
When he slept, he sometimes woke with a fist curled or with a dream that required him to go to the kitchen and grip a tool until dawn.
Martha watched him then, hands finding the place in a pocket where she kept dried comfrey for when he woke hot with a fever of memory. She had learned to recognize the signs, the tightening in his hands, the way his mouth would clench at a particular kind of laugh. He told her, once, about how a boy he had known had become smaller with each year of hunting, and how men turned each other into narratives to make the living easier to swallow. She pressed the heel of her hand to his and told him she would not let the mountain make him less than himself. The years folded in. They kept vows without fuss. When the barn's roof leaked, they fixed it. When a trap tugged at the wrong time, they mended it. When winter tried the seam of their life, they pressed together and restitched. In the small of the domestic, they found a religion that needed no sermon. Their prayers were the lights they kept, the quilts they sewed, the stew they stretched. They promised each morning not the big things, but the daily survival. Keep the fire tonight, check the line at dawn, come home with something for supper. Neighbors came and went, some staying longer than others. A boy with a face like a map of work learned to shoot straight, and Martha would teach him to skin a rabbit without spoiling too much meat. An old woman named Agnes, who had been a midwife on the other side of the ridge, stopped by to trade knowledge: how to lay a herb to draw fever without making a man more likely to faint. The mountain was full of small teachers, and in such an education there was less room for the cruel catcalls of a market square. One late afternoon, months before the second winter's worst, a man came up the trail with shoes that had seen a road and a posture that had been taught to hide shame. He handed them a folded paper that shook in the way a confession will when it is not yet apologized enough. The signature below the neat washing of ink was Mayor Pritchard's, but the hand was different now, softer, perhaps, from a man who had measured guilt for too long. There was apology and then offer, help with supplies, free trade, an invitation to the town's market day. They read it and set it by the hearth. If one believed in the magical power of such things, they might think of forgiveness as snow that could be brushed away with a sleeve. Martha regarded the town's note like one might regard a fragile animal, possible, but not to be taken for granted. It was not a matter of pride so much of principle. The town's offer had the ring of convenience. Its apology arrived at a speed that suggested nothing had truly changed in the people who had once called her names. "We built a loom out of our needs," Martha told Silas that evening, as the light thinned and the stove threw out the small, steady heat between them. "We can go back, but only if we go back as ourselves, not as a story they can tidy up and pin." Silas drank from his mug and watched the steam lift slow. "We have all the things that matter," he said, meaning the room, the wood, the hands. "A town can hand you niceties. It cannot hand you the work." Their refusal was a seal on a life now claimed. It was not spite. It was a decision made in the sober light of two people who had survived being small talk and had turned themselves into something that required honest labor. The apology kindled no flame of wanting to return. It warmed nothing in them beyond the acknowledgement that the town could do the hard thing of admitting error if it chose to. They would not be the object lesson. Years smoothed them into a community in miniature. They had domestic rituals: a pot of nettle soup on Tuesdays, a small game of rolling a bottle between them on Fridays to decide who went to barter. They built a bed frame out of wood salvaged from an old fence. It creaked like a testament to thrift. There were quiet moments where Silas would trace a seam on Martha's palm and tell her something small: a place on the mountain he wanted to show her, a piece of wood with a grain like a river,
the place where the wind sounds like a herd. Martha told him, in return, about a patch of comfrey that would make a poultice better than any dock salve, and about a name of a quilt pattern she had never shared with anyone because it felt like a prayer. They had a life stitched from attentions and oversight, not from grand declarations. When winter came heavy and the stove became their friend and their judge, they pressed inwards and repeated the small vow that had become their liturgy: never stop. It was both a practical command and a promise of tenderness. They said it in the dark without theatrics, and it held more substance than the empty pronouncements the town had offered in a ribboned letter. In the end, they were not trophies for a town's conscience, nor a tale for taverns. They remained two stubborn people who had chosen one another, and in that choice found refuge. The mountain accepted them, not because it was merciful, but because it understood the arithmetic of usefulness. Martha's hands kept the world mended. Silas's arms kept the world defended. They kept one another. On a final winter night, thick with the possibility of breaking, they stacked the last of the wood and closed the shutters tight. The world outside was white and fair and deaf. Inside, the stove gave a steady heart. They lay together with quilts pulled up to their chins, faces warmed and familiar, and watched the small sparks make tiny departures into the chimney. Silas turned his face to Martha, and, with the tiredness that comes from a life well lived and a body well used, he mouthed the words they had worn like an armor and an embrace. "Never stop," he said. Martha took his hand and felt it closed around hers the way it had the first night they had packed a horse onto a sled. There were no great epiphanies in that clasp, only the infinite practice of choosing each other again.
"Never," she said, and the sound in her voice folded the world into a safer shape. Outside, the mountain kept its long watch. Inside, two people who had been misread by a town and found by each other carried on the small sacred work of survival and care. Their story would be told, perhaps, in the town in whispers softened by embarrassment or edged with curiosity. It would be told on the mountain as a simple fact: they had stoked one another through winters and days. Theirs was not a legend of thunder. It was the steady labor of two bodies making warmth where the world could have chosen frost. They pressed closer, a human geography that had learned to shelter and be sheltered. The last ember dimmed, and the night leaned in like a question. They answered not with great speeches, but with the everyday lullaby of hands and breath. Never stop. Never.